This morning we're looking again at John 4, and I believe this is the third one of a series on the same passage, which I find a really interesting concept, and I'd imagine it's been really interesting for you as well to look at this from lots of different angles. So I'm just going to share with you again those verses in John 4, well, some of them anyway. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard Jesus is baptizing more disciples than John, although it was not Jesus himself but his disciples who baptized, he left Judea and started back to Galilee. But he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water, gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "Well, you're right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands. And the one you have now is not your husband. What you've said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things." Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." Just then his disciples came, and they were astonished that he was speaking with a woman, but no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you speaking to her?" Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" They left the city and were on their way to him. And I'll leave it there. It is an amazing passage. And probably when Graham got in touch to say, would I come and preach, the fact that it was this passage had an influence on my answer, because I just love this passage. I know that you've done a whole thing to do with place and the fact that Jesus is in Samaria, and the very fact that he travelled through there is unusual and it is strange. And maybe he knew he had this divine appointment. But what do we know about this woman? This woman coming to the well in the middle of the day, that's a really odd thing to do. Really peculiar. Don't know if you've ever been to the Middle East or somewhere desert-like. My word, is it hot. We were in Israel around about June, in about 2012, I think it was. And you don't want to be out in that heat, whoever you are. But she's out in the heat collecting water. Maybe we think that she was avoiding other people. She didn't want to be seen by the rest of her village. We'll think about that a bit later. And then we read in verse 7 that Jesus is far from polite. And however you look at this phrase, you cannot make it polite. Give me a drink. Well, that's plain rude in my book. And I think in a Middle Eastern culture it's rude too. Give me a drink. But what a forthright woman. She replies equally bluntly, saying to him, you and I shouldn't even be talking to each other. I find her reaction quite surprising, that she is so forthright, equally blunt back to him. I'm not qualified to talk to you. She says, you're a Jewish man. I'm a Samaritan woman. And she's also thinking internally, perhaps, and I'm a disgraced, shamed woman. Maybe that's the internal tape. It doesn't come out of her mouth at that point. Jesus then engages in this amazing theological conversation, doesn't he? It is just incredible. And I think you've looked at some of this as well. If you knew the gift of God and who I am, you could have living water. You know, if I've gone to the supermarket and I'm trying to buy some drink and someone tells me, don't bother with that drink, have living water, I'd think they'd lost the plot. I'm sorry, I'm thirsty, I wish to drink this. What are you talking about? And surely, that must be in her head. However, she says, you don't have a bucket. It's got to be my favourite phrase of the whole passage. You don't have a bucket. Why would you be at a well wanting a drink if you don't have anything to draw water with? She is saying. So if you can't even get water out of the well with a bucket, how can you give me living water? You don't have a bucket, sir. So he wants a drink from her bucket, from a Samaritan woman's bucket, when he would become ceremonially unclean, because all Samaritans were unclean. She would have known that. In all this dialogue together, just this woman and Jesus, there are no crowds, no disciples, no friends of hers, no villagers. It's Jesus and a lonely, hurt, broken woman, and yet one who is also a survivor. I call this encounter an inspirational encounter. She went out on an ordinary day to do her ordinary routine, to collect water in the heat of the day so she wouldn't meet anybody. I wonder we know part of how she handled this, but deep inside, how did she handle this? And what I wonder is, did she have the nerve to look into his eyes? I think she may have done, because she's quite forthright. And why does it matter whether she looked into his eyes or not? Well, that's a powerful thing, isn't it? Looking into someone's eyes. It's also a highly cultural thing. I don't know whether you've met people from the Netherlands or South Africa. They're the two countries where I've worked with people from those areas, and they give much stronger eye contact than us British people do. And it can make you feel a bit like, oh, what have I done? Because they look at you strongly all of the time when they are talking. And us British folk don't do that. Looking into someone's eyes is profoundly significant. And I think she would have looked Jesus in the eye. How do we feel about looking into the eyes of Jesus? In your prayer time, have you ever thought about looking into the eyes of Jesus? What is it that makes you think, oh, I couldn't do that? What is it that perhaps makes that trigger in your brain? This unnamed woman is confronted by a strange Jewish man, and he starts talking profound theology to her. There's a phrase in the counselling circles, unconditional positive regard is the phrase. And it means when another human being looks at you, and you know by just their look that they accept you and are ready to listen. It's a profound, deep experience when that happens to you if you're feeling lost or broken or profoundly sad. Jesus gave this woman, of course, unconditional, positive regard, and so much more. How powerful was that? Did that give her the freedom to have this conversation, that moment of her knowing this man was safe to talk to? Then you have this phrase of Jesus saying that, I can give you living water. You can never be thirsty again. How very odd. But this unexpected man, who looked deep into her very soul, she knew he had something she desperately needed. And all of a sudden, the conversation that had been about Jacob's well and where the Samaritans worshipped and where the Jews worshipped and what the future would hold, all of a sudden she knew he had something she needed. And so she says in verse 15, "Sir, give me this water, that I might never be thirsty again." At this point, you get another harsh response from Jesus, don't you? First, we've got to give me the drink. But then you get the phrase, "First, go and fetch your husband." So she's been in this dialogue with this man who made her feel safe, who allowed her the freedom to dialogue with him, which would be unusual. And then he says, "First, go and fetch your husband." Now, to me, that makes me feel, well, surely that would have just shut her down completely. Oh my word, what does he know? You see, in this society, honour and shame were massive. And our society has lost this, but if you went to Japan or met people of a Japanese background, they'd fully understand honour and shame. Likewise, other places in Southeast Asia, maybe some places still in Africa. You see, what mattered was the honour that you and your family were held in by your village. Or, conversely, had you shamed your family, therefore brought shame on the village? She's there at midday, not wanting to be seen by anyone. I believe this is a woman who felt shamed and did not have the honour of her village. Otherwise, why was she avoiding them? And Jesus says, "Go and fetch your husband." And I suspect that's where the shame lies. And we learn that, in fact, she had 5 husbands, and the man she currently was with wasn't her husband. In years gone by, I've often thought perhaps this was a woman of loose morals or whatever. In the last few years, as I reflect, and it is my theory, I think about this differently. I think this is a woman that's been pushed from pillar to post. I think it's likely she had little choice about these men as her husband. The Samaritans lived by many of the same Jewish laws as the people of Israel did. The kinship laws, which we read about in Ruth. It wasn't safe or right for a woman to be single. Therefore, a husband is found for you from among the family. I don't think she had choice about her 5 husbands. This isn't a woman who was cashing in one husband and having another one just because she fancied it. I think this is a woman that had been handed from one husband to another. Therefore, I think we perhaps need to view her as a victim, and one has been used rather than a loose woman of weak moral standing. This makes the whole dialogue with Jesus even more remarkable, and probably why Jesus says, "First go and fetch your husband." He needed her to know, "I know." He needed the woman to know that he knew. He knew what she had been through. He knew her history. He knew the other men in her life. And perhaps she'd never felt valued by another man. He reveals that she has been wronged in her life and she is broken. But here is a man who has seeming authority. He's obviously some kind of religious leader. His very regard of her and the fact that he's not condemning her for what he already knows, the fact that he's asking for drink from her bucket, a Samaritan woman, and placing himself in a place of being unclean, conversing with her as an equal, begins to release and heal her. It's this inspirational encounter of Jesus himself that changes her profoundly. I had someone say just one sentence to me once that transformed how I thought about something. Not quite on the same level as this woman, but I'll share it anyway. I was a member of a church that didn't believe in women preaching or being ordained or being in leadership. I worked for a Christian charity run by a guy, Baptist minister called Dennis Pevers, who you may or may not have come across. And the church was saying I couldn't do this, that and the other. By the way, I had no desire to preach at that point in time. Didn't think it was something I could ever do. But God was saying to me, no, not at that point, that wasn't the case. Roll back a bit. So the guy that ran the charity that I was working for said to me, we'd like you to become one of our directors. I ran the gap year. And I said to him, you know what our church thinks about women in leadership. And he said to me, an ordained Baptist minister, a man of authority in my eyes, he said to me, it's not gender that matters, it's gifting. That sentence was utterly transformative for what then followed, and probably enabled me to hear God's calling to go into pastoral ministry. It's not gender that matters, it's gifting. And I share that because God does these drop a pebble in the pond moments, doesn't he? And this woman's encounter with Jesus wasn't just a pebble in a pond, was it? It was a rock at the bottom of a waterfall, really. It's absolutely huge. And she knows she's in the presence of someone who is offering her truth, a truth which she's never really seen or known before. And the jigsaw pieces begin to fall into place for her. And she begins to darely think the thought, the very unspeakable. And she phrases it as, I know that the Messiah called Christ is coming, and I know that when he comes, he'll explain everything to us. I feel like she's testing the water. I feel like she is saying, well, with the conversation I've had with you, am I getting what you're saying? Am I hearing you right when you say you bring living water, when you say you will bring truth, when you say that all people will worship in spirit and in truth? She has this inspirational encounter with this Jewish man at this village well who knows all that ever did about her, who begins to lift her shame from her. And she begins to think, I know that the Messiah, the Christ, is coming. Maybe, perhaps, could it be? And Jesus says, I am he. Wow. Even when John the Baptist asked him this question, are you the Messiah? Jesus doesn't answer it. He doesn't do this. But in Samaria, in this foreign land, with this foreign woman, Jesus uses the phrase, I am he. The phrase I am wouldn't have had quite such strong overtones for her as a non-Jewish person as it would in the Jewish context. But nonetheless, he reveals himself as I am he, the Messiah, the one who you think is coming, is standing here right in front of you. He does this to a woman who is broken and abused, and more than that, a Samaritan woman. He brings her all truth in this midday encounter on a hot desert area by a well. It's part of his healing and his restoration as he reveals this to her. Is it any wonder then that she then does what she does? When we've gone on this journey, on this conversation with her, and perhaps tried to put ourselves inside of her to understand what she was experiencing, is it any wonder that she then, well, I do find this bit amazing, leaves her bucket, leaves her water jar, and runs off back to the village, to the people that she's been avoiding and didn't want to be able to be seen, and says to them, "Come and see the man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" She's got this hope within her. I desperately need to believe this is who it is, because boy, has he made me feel different. It's like he's clothed me in different clothes, she could be saying. And she left her water jar. She left her water jar. That's more than losing your mobile phone or your credit card, frankly. It's more than that. That is her life. Her water jar is her life. We need water for life. Without it, as she said to Jesus, how are you going to draw water? She left her water jar. Why? Because she'd found the one that was going to give her living water. And she's so excited, she just forgets it, I think. To me, it is so strong and so powerful, this. The healing for her here is so pure and sweet, and she has to rush off and share it with others. And we read the consequence of that in verse 39. I didn't go on to read this far. It says, many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. More than that, he actually went and stayed in the village for 2 days. And they had their own inspirational encounter. We no longer believe just because of what you said, the woman. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know this man is really the Saviour of the world. Not only did Jesus receive a drink from a Samaritan woman that made him unclean, he and his disciples probably went and stayed in the village for 2 days. Jews can't stay in a Samaritan village. We can't get our head round that. I can come to Trowbridge and it's never a problem. I could go to Scotland, it's not a problem. I can go to Wales, it's not a problem. I can go to France. But they couldn't stay in a Samaritan village. And because of this woman and this inspirational encounter, the mission to the Gentiles begins. I think she becomes the first evangelist, is what I think. We don't know for sure, because things in the Bible aren't necessarily in a nice, timely order. But when you consider that we often think the mission to the Gentiles begins with Peter's vision on the roof in Acts 10, actually, it's already happened. He's just following on what God has already done. So what made her respond that way? What made her this amazing evangelist? What is it? What is it? And you know, it's because she had this life-transforming, inspirational encounter with Jesus. It's because she looked into his eyes. It's because he took time with her and she chose to listen. She could have remained silent. She could have walked away. She could have not given him a drink. Or lots of could-haves, perhaps, would-have-beens. But no, there was something about this man that made her look and stop and think and see. She had a life-transforming, inspirational encounter with Jesus. Have we had an inspirational encounter with Jesus that changes us? As Jesus held her gaze with his unconditional positive regard and gradually revealed who he was, so the healing over her life is poured out. That very deep encounter meant she rushed off and left her bucket and had to tell people about him. Is this the difference we need in order to do what Graham was talking about earlier and share our faith? The inspirational, transformational encounter, which for us comes through the Holy Spirit, comes through perhaps others praying for us, might come through going to different places to worship like New Mine, might come through sitting in a service and allowing God to do what he's knocking on your door to do, which comes through going to a close friend to say, will you pray with me about this? I want it to be different, and it's not. It comes through vulnerability. She was vulnerable, and Jesus met her there, and in no way did he cause her any harm. He was totally safe. And the church, in inverted commas, grew because of this woman. And the church does grow because of women and men like her who are willing to tell their story. And we all have a story to tell. So I leave you with those thoughts. What is your encounter with Jesus? Will you let it change you? And will you go and tell others your story because of that? Thank you.